The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across the polished marble floor as Amara Okafor stepped through the mahogany doors of Belmont's fine dining, her navy blazer crisp against her dark skin, her natural hair styled in an elegant twist. The restaurant's hostess, a blonde woman in her 20s with perfectly applied makeup, looked up from her reservation book with a smile that faltered the moment their eyes met. "I'm sorry, but we're completely booked tonight," the hostess said, her voice carrying that particular brand of politeness that felt like ice water. Amara glanced around the dining room, noting at least 6 empty tables adorned with white linens and silver place settings. The soft murmur of conversation from the handful of diners, all white, all well-dressed, created a soundtrack of exclusion that made her chest tighten. She had made this reservation 3 weeks ago for her parents' 40th wedding anniversary, specifically requesting the corner table by the window where her father could watch the sunset over the city. "I have a reservation under Okafor," she said, keeping her voice steady despite the familiar burn of humiliation creeping up her neck. "7:30 for 3 people?" The hostess made a show of running her finger down the reservation book, her pink nail polish catching the light. "I don't see anything here. Perhaps you made it at one of our other locations?" Amara knew there were no other locations. Belmont's was the only high-end restaurant in Millbrook, a small city where she had grown up, left for college and law school, and recently returned to practice family law. She also knew that her reservation was in that book, because she had called to confirm it that morning. The woman on the phone had been perfectly pleasant then, before she walked through the door. The thing about being a 32-year-old black woman with 2 Harvard degrees is that you learn to recognize the difference between genuine mistakes and deliberate slights. Amara had experienced enough of both to know which category this fell into. She pulled out her phone and showed the hostess her confirmation email, watching as the woman's face shifted from feigned confusion to barely concealed annoyance. "Oh, that reservation," the hostess said, her voice dropping the pretense of politeness. "I'm afraid we had to give that table away. You were 5 minutes late." Amara glanced at her Rolex, a gift from her parents when she passed the bar exam. It was 7:28. She had arrived 2 minutes early. "I'm not late," she said quietly, "and I'd like to speak with the manager." The hostess's smile became a thin line. "Mr. Belmont is busy with other guests. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at the diner down the street?" The words hung in the air like smoke, carrying implications that made Amara's hands clench into fists at her sides. Around them, the conversations continued, but she could feel the weight of curious stares from other diners. Some looked away quickly when she caught their eyes, while others watched with the uncomfortable fascination of people witnessing a scene they hoped wouldn't escalate. "I'll wait," Amara said, her voice carrying the authority she had learned to wield in courtrooms. "I'm not leaving until I speak with the manager." The hostess's composure cracked slightly. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. You're disturbing our other guests." The irony wasn't lost on Amara that she was disturbing the peace simply by standing there, existing in a space that clearly didn't want her. She looked around one more time, memorizing faces, noting details. The elderly couple at table 4 who whispered behind their hands. The businessman at the bar who had turned completely around to stare. The group of women at the window table, her table, who had gone silent to listen. "Fine," she said, turning back to the hostess. "I'll leave. But this isn't over." As she walked toward the door, she heard the hostess mutter something about people who don't know their place. The words were meant to be quiet, but Amara's hearing was excellent, honed by years of catching whispered conversations in courtrooms and boardrooms, where people assumed she couldn't hear them. The cool evening air hit her face as she stepped outside, and she took a deep breath, trying to calm the rage that threatened to consume her rational mind. She had 2 choices. She could go home, tell her parents what happened, and find somewhere else to celebrate their anniversary. Or she could do what she did best. Research, plan, and execute a strategy that would ensure this never happened to anyone else. Amara Okafor had never been one to back down from a fight, especially when that fight involved injustice. Growing up as one of only 3 black families in Millbrook, she had learned early that silence in the face of discrimination was complicity. Her parents, both teachers who had moved to the predominantly white suburb for better opportunities, had taught her that education was her weapon and persistence was her shield. She walked to her car, a sensible Honda Civic that she had bought with her first paycheck from the law firm, and sat in the parking lot for a moment, thinking. The Belmont family had owned this restaurant for 30 years, and it was considered the crown jewel of Millbrook's small downtown district. Richard Belmont, the current owner, was in his 50s, a second-generation restaurateur who had inherited the business from his father. He was also, according to local gossip, a significant donor to various political campaigns and community organizations. Amara started her car and drove home to her small apartment above the law office she shared with another attorney. Her parents were probably wondering where she was, but she needed time to think before she faced them. The apartment was sparse but comfortable, with legal texts lining the walls and a small desk where she often worked late into the night, preparing cases. She opened her laptop and began researching. The first thing she discovered was that Belmont's had been cited 3 times in the past 5 years for health code violations. Nothing major, but enough to suggest that the restaurant's pristine reputation might not be entirely deserved. The second thing she found was more interesting. The restaurant had received a significant tax break from the city council 2 years ago, justified by their contribution to local tourism and employment. Amara leaned back in her chair, her mind beginning to formulate a plan. If Belmont's was going to discriminate against customers, she would make sure the entire community knew about it. But she would need more than just her word against theirs. She would need evidence, documentation, and witnesses. Over the next 2 weeks, Amara became a regular presence in downtown Millbrook, but not in the way anyone expected. She visited the coffee shop across the street from Belmont's, positioning herself where she could observe the restaurant's clientele. She spoke with other business owners, subtly asking about their experiences with the Belmont family. She reviewed public records, looking for any information that might be relevant to her case. What she discovered was a pattern. 3 other black families had attempted to make reservations at Belmont's over the past year, and all had been turned away with various excuses. A Hispanic family had been seated at the worst table in the restaurant, next to the kitchen door, despite having a reservation for a better location. An Asian couple had been told their credit card was declined, even though they had paid for dinner at 3 other restaurants that same week without issue. But perhaps most importantly, Amara learned that Belmont's had applied for a liquor license expansion that would allow them to serve alcohol on their outdoor patio. The application was currently under review by the city council, which meant they needed to maintain their reputation as a pillar of the community. Amara also discovered that the mayor of Millbrook, Patricia Williams, was a black woman who had been elected the previous year on a platform of inclusive economic development. She had known Mayor Williams in passing. They had served on a committee together to address housing discrimination, but they weren't close friends. The plan that emerged was elegant in its simplicity. Amara would document the discrimination, gather testimonies from other affected families, and then present the evidence to the proper authorities. But she would also ensure that the Belmont family understood exactly what they were losing by their prejudice. She started by contacting the families who had been turned away from the restaurant. Some were reluctant to speak, afraid of retaliation or unwilling to relive painful experiences. But others were eager to share their stories, grateful that someone was finally listening. Maria Santos, a nurse at the local hospital, had been denied a table for her daughter's quinceañera celebration. The Kim family, who owned a successful accounting firm, had been told their reservation was lost, despite having a confirmation number. Each conversation added another layer to the evidence Amara was building. She documented dates, times, witnesses, and the specific language used by restaurant staff. She also gathered information about the restaurant's business practices, including their hiring record, which showed a notable absence of black or Hispanic employees in customer-facing positions. The breakthrough came when she spoke with Jenny Martinez, a former server at Belmont's who had been fired 6 months earlier. Jenny revealed that Richard Belmont had explicit instructions about seating arrangements, requiring staff to place certain customers in less desirable areas of the restaurant, or to claim tables were unavailable when they weren't. He would say things like, "We need to maintain our ambiance," or "Some people just don't fit our brand," Jenny told Amara during a quiet conversation at a coffee shop across town. "I knew it was wrong, but I needed the job. When I started pushing back, he found reasons to let me go." Jenny agreed to provide a written statement about her experiences, which gave Amara the insider testimony she needed to support the other evidence she had gathered. With her documentation complete, Amara scheduled a meeting with Mayor Williams. She presented her case methodically, the way she would to a judge, laying out the pattern of discrimination with facts, dates, and witness testimony. She also explained the broader implications for the community, particularly given the city's stated commitment to diversity and inclusion. Mayor Williams listened carefully, asking pointed questions and taking notes. When Amara finished her presentation, the mayor leaned back in her chair and was quiet for a long moment. "This is serious," she said finally. "If these allegations are true, it's not just a civil rights issue, it's a betrayal of the public trust. We've given this restaurant significant tax benefits based on their contribution to our community values." The mayor agreed to investigate the matter, but she also suggested a more immediate approach. The city council was hosting a community dinner the following week, and they had planned to present Belmonts with a community service award for their contributions to local tourism. Mayor Williams proposed that they use this opportunity to address the discrimination allegations publicly. "I think it's time Mr. Belmont learned that Millbrook's community values include treating everyone with dignity and respect," she said. Amara felt a mixture of anticipation and nervousness as the plan took shape. The community dinner would be attended by local business leaders, city officials, and prominent residents. It would be the perfect venue to expose the truth about Belmont's discriminatory practices. The night of the community dinner, Amara arrived at the Civic Center wearing a black dress that struck the perfect balance between professional and elegant. She had invited her parents, who still didn't know the full extent of what she had been planning, and they sat together at a table near the front of the room. The evening proceeded normally through the welcome remarks and the presentation of several community awards. Then Mayor Williams took the podium and announced that they had originally planned to present Richard Belmont with a community service award, but that recent information had come to light that required their attention. "Before we make this presentation," the mayor said, her voice carrying clearly through the room, "I think it's important that we address some concerning allegations about discriminatory practices at Belmont's restaurant." Amara watched as Richard Belmont's face went pale. He was seated at the head table with other honored guests, his wife beside him, both of them dressed in expensive clothing that suddenly seemed to emphasize their discomfort. Mayor Williams then invited Amara to the podium. As she walked to the front of the room, she could hear whispers spreading through the crowd. Some people recognized her from around town, but others were clearly wondering who she was and why she was speaking at this event. 3 weeks ago, Amara began, her voice steady and clear, "I attempted to have dinner at Belmont's restaurant with my parents to celebrate their 40th wedding anniversary. Despite having a confirmed reservation, I was told no tables were available, even though I could see empty tables throughout the restaurant. When I questioned this, I was told I would be more comfortable at the diner down the street." The room fell silent. Amara continued, methodically presenting the evidence she had gathered, sharing testimonies from other families who had experienced similar treatment, and explaining the pattern of discrimination that had emerged. She spoke about Maria Santos, who had been denied a table for her daughter's quinceañera. She mentioned the Kim family, successful business owners who had been told their reservation was lost. She shared Jenny Martinez's testimony about explicit instructions to discriminate against certain customers. "This isn't about one bad evening," Amara said, looking directly at Richard Belmont. "This is about a systematic pattern of discrimination that has no place in our community." When she finished, Mayor Williams returned to the podium. She announced that the city would be conducting a formal investigation into the allegations and that Belmont's liquor license expansion would be suspended pending the outcome. She also stated that any business receiving tax benefits from the city would be required to sign a non-discrimination agreement as a condition of continued support. Richard Belmont stood up, his face red with anger and embarrassment. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice carrying across the silent room. "We run a respectable establishment. We have the right to refuse service to anyone." "You have the right to refuse service for legitimate reasons," Mayor Williams replied calmly. "You don't have the right to discriminate based on race, and you certainly don't have the right to do so while receiving public support." The evening ended with several community members approaching Amara to share their own experiences with discrimination at various local businesses. Some offered support for her efforts, while others thanked her for having the courage to speak up. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came when Mrs. Henderson, an elderly white woman who had been dining at Belmont's for 20 years, approached Richard Belmont as he was leaving. "I heard what that young lady said," Mrs. Henderson told him, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had lived through decades of social change. "And I'm ashamed that I never noticed what was happening in a place where I spent my money. You won't be getting any more of my business." Several other long-time customers made similar statements, and Amara realized that the community was more ready for change than she had expected. The investigation that followed confirmed everything Amara had documented. The city found evidence of systematic discrimination, and Belmont's was required to pay significant fines, undergo sensitivity training for all staff, and implement new hiring practices that emphasized diversity and inclusion. The restaurant's tax benefits were revoked, and their liquor license expansion was permanently denied. But the real victory came 6 months later when Amara received a call from Jenny Martinez. Jenny had been hired as the new manager of Belmont's, after Richard Belmont was forced to step down from day-to-day operations. Under new ownership, a partnership between Jenny and 2 other local business owners, the restaurant had become truly welcoming to all customers. "We'd love to have you and your parents come in for dinner," Jenny said. "I think you'll find the experience quite different now." Amara accepted the invitation, and on a warm evening in late spring she walked through the same mahogany doors she had entered months earlier. The restaurant looked the same, but the atmosphere was completely different. The staff was diverse, the clientele was mixed, and the hostess, a young black woman with a genuine smile, greeted her warmly. "Welcome to Belmont's," the hostess said. "Do you have a reservation?" "Yes," Amara replied, smiling. "Okafor, party of 3. "Perfect," the hostess said, checking her book. "Right this way. I have a lovely table by the window for you." As they were seated at the corner table, where her father could watch the sunset, Amara felt a sense of completion that went beyond personal satisfaction. She had not set out to destroy anyone's livelihood or to seek revenge for its own sake. Instead, she had used her skills and knowledge to create positive change for her entire community. Her parents, who had finally learned the full story of what had happened, were proud but not surprised. They had raised their daughter to stand up for what was right, even when it was difficult. "You know," her father said as they looked out at the sunset, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, "this is exactly the kind of dinner we should have had for our anniversary. Not just the food or the view, but the knowledge that we're welcome here because we're human beings, not in spite of our skin color." Amara nodded, understanding that her victory was not just about one restaurant or one night. It was about the kind of community she wanted to live in, the kind of world she wanted to help create for the next generation. As they raised their glasses in a toast to 40 years of marriage and to the power of standing up for justice, Amara realized that the best revenge was not destroying those who had wronged her, but ensuring that their capacity to wrong others was forever diminished. She had turned her moment of humiliation into a catalyst for positive change, and in doing so, had made her community a better place for everyone. The young lawyer who had been refused service 3 weeks earlier was the same person sitting at that table now, but she was also transformed. She had learned that justice, when pursued with intelligence and determination, could create ripples of change that extended far beyond the original injustice, and she had discovered that sometimes the most powerful response to being told you don't belong is to change the entire definition of belonging itself. 3 months after that dinner, Amara received an unexpected visitor at her law office. Richard Belmont stood in her doorway, looking older and more weathered than she remembered. His expensive suit had been replaced with simple khakis and a polo shirt, and the arrogance that had once defined him seemed to have evaporated entirely. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly, his hands clasped behind his back. "What I did was wrong. What my restaurant did was wrong." Amara gestured to the chair across from her desk, studying his face for signs of insincerity. She had learned to read people carefully in her legal practice, and what she saw was genuine remorse mixed with something that looked like relief. "I lost everything," he continued. "The restaurant, my reputation, most of my friends. But you know what? I deserved to lose it. I spent 30 years building a business on the wrong foundation." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was a check made out to the Millbrook Community Center's youth program. "This won't fix what I did, but maybe it can prevent someone else from making the same mistakes I made. Jenny told me you volunteer there on weekends." Amara accepted the check, noting the substantial amount. She looked up at him, seeing not the arrogant restaurant owner who had enabled discrimination, but a man who had finally understood the weight of his actions. "Change is possible for everyone," she said simply, "even when it comes late." After he left, Amara sat quietly in her office, thinking about the unexpected paths that justice could take. Sometimes revenge wasn't about punishment at all. It was about creating space for people to become better versions of themselves. And sometimes, the most powerful victory was watching your former enemy choose to join the fight for what was right.